Good afternoon. I'm Ellen Weiss. I am the Executive Director for the Society for Research on Educational Effectiveness. We are delighted to have you joining us today for our third webinar in our series, Critical Perspectives and Quantitative Methods, funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Our moderator today is Dr. Ayin Grooms. Grooms is an assistant professor in the College of Education at the University of Iowa. Her research focuses on the ways that race, class, and policy impact the achievement of historically disenfranchised students. She will be talking more about the series and today's webinar in a moment.
Thanks, Ellen. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar series. Again, my name is Ayin Grooms, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Iowa, and I'm also one of the co-planners of this series. This is a 6-part series focused on criticality and quantitative work along the lines of race, gender, income, sexual orientation, and more. Our first webinar focused on providing an overview on the multiple avenues to exploring critical quantitative research, and the second focused on applying theories of race to quantitative models in research as well. Both webinars are available to view on the SREE website. Today is the third webinar in the series titled Racial and Ethnic Identities and Administrative Data. So this webinar series, again, is funded with generous support by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and is co-sponsored by SREE, AEFP, AERA Division L, and the ASH Council on Public Policy and Higher Education. I want to thank my wonderful colleagues and co-planners for this series, Drs. Dominique Baker at Southern Methodist University, Lindsay Page at Brown University, and Jason Taylor at the University of Utah. Also, a very special thank you to Ellen Weiss, Jennifer Cush, and their team at SREE for their coordination and planning of the series. Before we get into the discussion today, please note that our next webinar is scheduled for Friday, May 20th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and will feature Drs. Matt Deemer from the University of Michigan and Aixa Marchand from Rhodes College discussing critical perspectives on measurement. So again, thanks for joining us for this webinar today. Our discussion today will focus on some of the challenges and potential solutions for constructing and using race and ethnicity measures in administrative or secondary data sets. Our speakers today are Dr. Dominique Baker and Dr. Samantha Viano. Dr. Baker is an assistant professor of education policy in the Annette Caldwell Simmons School of Education and Human Development and a faculty affiliate of the Data Science Institute at Southern Methodist University. Her research focuses on the ways that education policy affects and shapes the access and success of minoritized students in higher education. Dr. Viano is an assistant professor in the College of Education and Human Development at George Mason University. Her research focuses on evaluating policies and assessing school contexts that predominantly affect minoritized student populations and their teachers, including policies on school safety and security, online credit recovery, teacher retention, and methods for studying racial equity. And now I'll turn it over to Dr. Baker and Dr. Viano. Thank you.
Thank you so much for welcoming us. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Sam and I are very excited to be in community as we talk through and think about racial and ethnic identities and administrative data. So just to give you sort of a broad overview on this. So I am Dominique Baker, and Sam and I go way back to our beautiful days in graduate school at Vanderbilt University. But we both bring an general interest that we share, but also some of our own unique experiences that have made us interested in this work. And so I can say, but before I'll hit into that in a moment, I do want to just set some scoping for our talk today, having said that. So number one, while we are going to talk about race and ethnicity and administrative data, I want everyone to keep in mind, this is not just about race and ethnicity. This is about gender. This is about all variables sort of you can think of. There's not enough time to talk about each one of these dimensions of sort of criticality that Dr. Grooms was mentioning earlier. But so I just want to make clear that while we are specifically focusing on thinking about race and ethnicity today, you should be applying these types of questions anytime that you're using administrative data. So that's number one. Number two, Sam and I are going to provide some overviews talking broadly about the motivation of this work, then getting into a bit about measurement within administrative data, and then thinking about analysis. So at the end of the measurement section, we'll pause, see if folks have questions about that broadly. And then at the end of the analysis section, we'll pause, see if people have questions. Then we'll do a sort of concluding section and then transition into just general questions. So as mentioned at the top by Ellen, if you have any questions that are coming up, please feel free to put them in the Q&A section, and we'll be collecting those questions to be able to check in on them as we sort of go along. But we want to make sure that this is helpful for you all. We want to really be thinking sort of from a broad systemic perspective, but then actually talking about real concrete recommendations about what people can do when they're interested in thinking about race and ethnicity in administrative data. Okay, so having said that, as I mentioned, I come to this work broadly. I do research that focuses on sort of, we can think of big P and little p policy. So thinking about state and federal policy measures, but also thinking about institutional policies and the way they shape the experiences of minoritized students within higher education. And that work can typically fall into areas looking at federal student financial aid, particularly thinking about student loans, affirmative action and race-conscious admissions policies, and campus equity climates, and what it means to create spaces where all students can thrive.
All right, and so thank you, Dominique, for the introduction to our topic and clarifying some of the things we're going to be talking about today. And similarly to Dominique, my broader research interests are on K-12 education policy and thinking about systemic issues that we encounter in K-12 education and the solutions that schools select to address those challenges, particularly for racially minoritized students and their teachers. And I just felt like my research was always butting up against this question of how we even measure racial identity and how we analyze it. And so that's how we came to the work as well as people who study more applied education policies, but then how do we even backtrack and think about how, if we're doing it in a holistic and authentic way. So with that, I'll transition into our broader motivation for what we're doing today. And when I think about why we became interested in this work, I think of speeding trains that are coming together in opposite opposing directions. So one speeding train is all this big data we have available to us. So Dominique and I are both primarily quantitative researchers. So we're using data supported by state longitudinal data system grants that include race ethnicity data. There's all these capabilities and this push for more quantitative data analysis. But opposing to that, coming in the opposite direction, is a speeding train problematizing this quantitative tradition, which rightly states that quantitative data has been used to weaponized against racially minoritized communities, growing interest, especially recently, in things like critical race theory. And these are both movements that are powerful and often end up clashing in very dramatic ways. And so when we were thinking about our place in this system, we want to be able to use these, big data systems, statewide or institution-wide data systems to understand racial inequality, while also recognizing the problematic history that critical theory helps us to think about that problematizes quantitative analysis of race and ethnicity. So we thought, how can we combine, how do we understand how to combine these perspectives? And so we did that through a systematic review of the literature, not just in education, but broadly in the sciences and social sciences. What we're going to talk about is widely informed by medicine, epidemiology, demography, sociology, so a broad set of fields that have thought about these questions about measurement analysis of race and ethnicity that I think provide some powerful lessons for education. So Dominique did an overview of this, but I'll just reiterate that I'm going to begin by getting more deeply into the ethical challenges and because those really inform how we give our suggestions on measurement and analysis. So the broad ethical challenges with race ethnicity data and analysis. Then we'll discuss concrete suggestions for creating a more critical measurement system, and then how to integrate those perspectives into analysis as well. So the two key players when I'm thinking about the ethical nature of these issues is on one side, Sir Francis Galton, the other side, W.E.B. Du Bois. So Sir Francis Galton and Du Bois, they were contemporaries, but really came to quantitative data from very different perspectives that continue to be really informative today. So Sir Francis Galton is widely credited as one of the fathers of statistics. You know, he's said to be the founder of things that are really foundational to what we continue to today, like the correlational coefficient. But he used these tools for nefarious purposes because he was a eugenicist who wanted to use quantitative data explicitly to create hierarchies among people by their racial and ethnic identity. So these tools are imbued with these eugenicist ideas by principle. The creator of them wanted to use them for these eugenist-based purposes. So often what you see in these debates about using quantitative data on race and ethnicity is that how could we possibly use these tools created by eugenicists to further racial equity? Could it even be possible? And the response to that is to reflect on the legacy of W.E.B. Du Bois, who in the same time period was a pioneer in data visualization, using data to aid liberation, post-Civil War, post-Reconstruction, thinking about how to use data to prove that there was a systematic racial inequality in cities. So we have an example there of the possibilities of using data to also address racial inequality. So we suggest 4 guiding principles that we reflect on in our work and in the paper we're discussing in this talk today about how to be Du Bois. So how do we make sure that we are furthering the lessons of Du Bois and avoiding the legacy of Galton and his contemporaries? So the first one, directly opposing Galton and his eugenicist ideas, race is socially constructed. It is dynamic. How someone identifies racially or ethnically is not fixed upon birth. It's not fixed in time. It can change over time. The example I always use for this, because it's from my personal background, is my grandmother when she was growing up, born in 1919 and pre-World War II. She always talked about how she had such difficulty getting a job because the job ads would say, white Anglo-Saxons only need apply. So as a young Jewish girl, she was not allowed to apply to jobs anywhere that she wanted to work. But then post-World War II, all of a sudden that was gone from the job ads. Now she could apply. Now she wasn't Jewish anymore. Now she was white. And we have a really long history in this country of different people being subsumed into the white racial identity, Irish, German immigrants who used to be different. Now we're all part of this one identity. So within someone's lifetime, this can easily change. This is not something that's static, it's dynamic. Second is I want to give you permission as quantitative researchers to release the illusion that our analyses are objective. Now, this is very hard for us because, I grew up, I went to college and I got a math degree in pure math. So, very objective there. But we need to understand as quantitative analysts that we make a lot of decisions even if we're not involved in data collection, which is a subjective exercise. We certainly clean the data and make a lot of decisions. We analyze the data and make a lot of decisions. And these decisions are subjective and political in and of themselves. So it's important to recognize our positionality when we are quantitative analysts. Having a position is not only in the realm of qualitative work, quantitative analysts do it as well. The third one is that we only can understand quantitative analysis as really having value if it reduces racial inequality. So if you are doing any quantitative analysis that involves or focuses on race, if you cannot reflect on that analysis and understand how it is reducing racial inequality, then we are concerned that we're veering off course a bit. So we always want to reflect on how our analyses, when they involve race, can be in service of reducing racial inequality. And the last one is that we seek to be asset oriented. So part of the issue, even if we're not eugenicists, if we're doing quantitative analysis, we can slip into deficit laden language very easily when we're sorting one group as lesser than another. So we want to make sure that we stay assets oriented and always try to focus on what people bring with them, not ranking people based on some set of outcomes that we've decided on. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dominique to get us started on measurement.
Okay, so we're going to talk about the big elephant in the room when it comes to thinking about the measurement of race and ethnicity. And so we're just going to start in with sort of what is perceived as sort of a major barrier to when it comes to thinking about how do we measure race and ethnicity, what's a better measure, all those sorts of pieces. Next slide. So we're doing an activity. You're all excited, I know. This is going to be in the chat. And so all I want you to do is think that I am a researcher cleaning state administrative data to create analytical files for others to use, right? So I am going to put together the files of data that will go out to people to actually conduct research with. Okay, so what I need you to do is look at the groups of students and their self-reported race ethnicities on the next slide. And I need 5 racial ethnic groups for the data. I can only have 5. So you will turn the slide over, you'll see them. And in the chat, I just want you to type what your 5 groups are. Okay, let's go for it. So these are 11 students. They were asked what their race or ethnicity is. This is what they wrote down. I need 5 groups from this. So we've got great things coming in the chat asking about like, can students choose only one option? I want more than 5. Yeah, all of these things, all of these vibes are exactly what we want you to be thinking about, but you only have 5. You can only pick 5. You are going to be sort of grouping the individual students. So what you want to think is you have 5 groups that all 11 of these students can fit into.
We've got a few.
Yeah, so we've got some that are coming in thinking like Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, 2 or more. Some people saying that IPEDS groups with maybe a Middle Eastern, so a North African Middle Eastern group. We've got people asking depending on what the data is being used for, but keep in mind, if you are a state administrator putting this together, you have no idea what the data will be used for. This could be used for any possible research project. So you can't know what the research questions are because a couple of people are asking about that. You cannot know. It's just, you put together data for the state of Texas and you say, anybody out there, we would love for you to do research. And so you have to go from there. Another person asked, is the quote Indian from Asia or from indigenous populations? And my response is, we have no idea. This is what the self-report tells us. I know this is hard, right? And yes, I do agree that as people are putting them in, I appreciate it. People saying things like, why can't we maintain the 11 groups? Yes, we will be talking about this. Yeah, so a lot of what we're seeing are sort of white, Black, Hispanic, Asian, other more than one. And but people are also bringing up, you know, that 5 is insufficient, that Black is not always the same as African American, which is completely true. Yeah. This is so good. Y'all are doing such good work. We've got one that's Caucasian, African American, Latinx, Hispanic, Asian, multiracial. Yeah, I know. Okay. So we can start slowing down. You all can still put in some more pieces if you want. But I think everyone's getting the vibes, and everyone should feel for the people that put together data sets off of people's self-reported information. Because this is really hard, right? This is really challenging work to try to think about how we quantify people's experiences, to think about how people's identities are sort of boiled down or not boiled down into these different set groups. And frequently, this can sort of range. We're going to talk about the census, but this is a real thing that several state administrative data sets have to choose to do. Right? We can have questions about whether or not they have to do it, but this is something that happens all the time. There are some states that actually have a choice around sort of the ranking of different groups that we'll talk a little bit more about, to sort of say, if you mark that you are Black and white, we are going to say that the Black subsumes the white, and so you are going to be Black in our data set. And if you are Black, white, and you say Hispanic, then you would go Black, but if you say that you are white and Hispanic, then you would be Hispanic. So there are all sorts of rules and pieces to how we create these political categories of race. And so that's one of the main things we want you to start getting into the mindset of thinking, because frequently we just receive data that was cleaned off of information like what you see on your screen. And so we want you to always be thinking about the messy real lives of people compared with the quantitative data that we receive. You can go to the next slide. So this is just some examples from the census, and thinking about things like, we get these ideas around the federal government creating an ethnicity section that is separate from a race section. That ethnicity section asks about whether you are of Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin. You have some options that you get to check that have a little bit more detail. And then you have a separate question for a person's race, which is being put as diametrically opposed to your ethnicity. Where you can then talk about white versus Black, African American, American Indian, or Alaskan Native. You have some other options that you can check, and then you also have space that you can write in if you want. And so we wanted to sort of give you broad strokes for this. And I think some questions, you're welcome to type into the chat if you want. I am checking it out as we go, but also I just want you to really be thinking about sort of, what do we think are the major issues with this as an approach to thinking about ethnicity and race? Sort of like, why might we not want to just copy the census's approach? And one of these is a very big thing that I believe Marilyn is saying that can be huge, is around the fact that when we create these types of groups, and we rely on sort of the census's ideas, we follow the census's rules for how they sort of code individuals. And that can be really tricky because, as one example, when we think about North African, Middle Eastern individuals, they are the #1 example of people who are slotted as white based on the census. So as long as you consider yourself of North African, Middle Eastern, you are considered as white, which gets back to this point that Sam was making and that several of you have made in the chat about these sort of political categories that we've created, that are meant to, in certain ways, right, sort of better understand how we can categorize people. I think one of the big pieces with this that Dr. Richard Blissett in the last webinar talked about in a really helpful and insightful way was showing that some of the ways that we originally codified what whiteness was, particularly when thinking about the difference between white and Caucasian, it was around denying property and rights to Asian individuals. And so we have to think really carefully about how we are crafting these categories that we use, because they have power. And so we're about to go to the next slide, but I want to make sure that we're not thinking that these categories are innocuous. Because something is socially constructed does not mean that it is attached, that is divorced from power. Frequently, our socially constructed categories have significant power and resources that are attached to them. Can we check out the next slide? So when we sort of think broadly about the census, we are just putting together some ideas. There's way more about this. And please, as we're thinking about this, if you have more questions, please feel free to throw them in the Q&A. But so we can think that like there's some great things about the census. It has self-reported race and ethnicity. And so this allows people the opportunity to report for themselves what their race or ethnicity is. And that's a thing that I don't want us to take for granted, because as Sam and I did our review of the literature, we found several instances that discuss the ways where researchers were able to examine the difference between someone's self-report and someone else's perception of their race, as an example, because like a hospital had forms where someone would complete and fill out what their race ethnicity is. And then there's a hospital administrator who also fills out a report and writes down what someone's race and ethnicity is. And so they were able to compare them and see all the ways that they differed, right? And so when we think about that, it matters, and it's incredibly important to think about whether or not we're getting self-reported information or we're talking about other people's perceptions of people's race and ethnicity. The second part for this is that there are comprehensive options within the census, including an option for other write-in, because frequently a lot of surveys, and this is a thing that some people are getting at in the chat, a lot of surveys may just give you options and you just have to check one or check whichever apply, quote unquote, but you don't have an option to write in. And so that can be sort of a very important part to this. And then another positive is that respondents can select multiple identities because, as I was just talking about, there are several surveys that people have to complete where they have to select only one group, which can be incredibly challenging because race and ethnicity are very complex. And frequently when we're thinking about trying to create just looking at one group, we're thinking about a sort of essentialism that gets back to these biological eugenicist ideas of sort of one drop rules. So those are all really positive pieces about the census. But there are several concerns with the census. We have two up here. There are more than this, but we could fill this entire presentation just talking about concerns with the census. But to sort of wrap this out, separating out the Hispanic ethnicity group is concerning for a number of reasons, in that there is a sort of false dichotomy at play around what the differences are between ethnicity and race. It erases ethnicities for other groups that are considered to solely be races. For example, when we think about Asian individuals, frequently when we do surveys and we ask Asian individuals about an ethnicity, they will tell you about their actual country ties, things of that nature. And so it is challenging to have structured the census in a way that sort of completely removes Hispanic groups and almost makes it as if they do not have a race based on these political definitions that the census has created of what an ethnicity and what a race is. And then the second part is something I mentioned earlier, because I saw it in the chat, that there's no category for Middle Eastern and Northern African individuals. They're categorized with white, despite the very real political importance of this separate category. There's just reams of very, very good research that talks about why this should be a separate political group that is just subsumed into the white group. And I do want to mention sort of as I talk through these push and pulls of the census, like, why does that matter? Why do we care so much about the census? Beyond the fact that the census drives a lot of policymaking decisions across the country, when we think about the way that a lot of colleges and universities, K-12 schools, districts, when they are thinking about how to ask about race and ethnicity to collect information to put into data sets, frequently they follow whatever the census says. As a higher ed researcher, I can tell you one of my favorite struggles when I'm using IPEDS data is using race data from 2008-9 to 2010, because there's a shift in how the census is categorizing race and ethnicity. And so you have to be really particular about which variables you're using when you cross that time period. So that's just one example of the ways that the census plays a very, very large role in how all other administrative data in the United States is collected when it comes to thinking about race and ethnicity. So it's really important when you want to use race and ethnicity in other areas that you understand how they built and constructed their measures around race and ethnicity. So basically, free yourself. You want to sort of keep what is good and try to release what is bad. And that can take shape in a lot of different ways. And so I'm going to toss this over to Sam to talk to us about that.
Yeah, so thank you, Dominique, for the census. It's the elephant in the room because it's often used as an excuse, like you said, to replicate the structure of administrative data based on the census, when in fact we shouldn't see it so much as restrictive, because if you actually look at broader literature outside of education, other federal agencies do use different measurement systems, and they use bridging methods to bridge their data back to census estimates. So if you're really in a place where you have to compare your data you're using to the census, you could look into these bridging methods, but use measures that are follow these principles that we're talking about, a lot of what Dominique was saying, and also what I'm going to talk about in a minute. And I'll just point out really quick, since it was on the last slide and it's come up in the chat a few times, that what we saw in the literature is that self-report is the gold standard. So whenever you have self-report, that's what you want to rely on, because of like the issues with the hospital administrator Dominique was mentioning, the reliability of others viewing what they think someone's race is versus what someone self-reports. So if we think of what just is recommended based on prior literature, we want to rely on self-reports if it's available, but it's not always available, unfortunately. But we can certainly talk about that more in the Q&A. So we have 6 concrete suggestions outside of just talking about the census for how to think about measurement in an administrative data system of race and ethnicity that we gathered from the literature. So I'll go through each one of these in turn. So the first is country of origin and language. These are particularly helpful when we think about these really broad pan-ethnicities, like Dominique mentioned, like Asian American, Pacific Islander, Latinx. So those are so broad that it's kind of makes it very difficult to understand inequality within those populations. And so it's common for administrative data systems to have some of these measures, but incorporating as many of these measures of country of origin language that we can, the more we're going to understand inequality across things like language and ethnicity. So this is an example of 3 administrative data systems in Texas, New York, and Florida, and what they have available. And I think you'll pretty commonly, in at least the K-12 space, have primary spoken language that's collected upon admissions into the educational system to know if someone needs English language services. So all 3 states have primary spoken language in this Venn diagram. And you can see also the Venn diagram overlaps between Florida and New York, where they both have a measure of whether or not the student was born in the US. Florida, in addition, has country of citizenship, and New York has immigration status. So these are some ways that administrative data already incorporates these kind of measures, although we could certainly think more broadly and more consistently collect these kind of measures in administrative data. The next one is much less common. So there's literature about inequality by skin tone and other different kinds of ways we think about color within racial identities. So there's pretty in-depth literature on this, but administrative data has really not integrated any of these measures. So I put an example up on the slide of a self-report phenotype measure that's been validated on surveys, which would be an example of something that could be part of an administrative data system, asking someone to describe their own skin color. But I just want to point out at the same time that we could get back in the same issue where we're asking someone else to choose this measure. So if you Google it, you'll find these pictures where there's like a worksheet with like 20 different faces on it, where they'll have like different skin tones on each face. But when those has been tested, they do have pretty low reliability. So not to suggest that others should be assigning this, but still self-report of how people see their coloring as they would describe, that could then help us to understand inequality more in depth in administrative data. The next one is political relevance. So we saw this a lot when we looked at articles internationally. So political relevance, how we define race and ethnicity in one country versus another is totally different, but it could also be very regional in the US. So I have the example here to say what I mean by political relevance from the University of California system, which publishes enrollment data disaggregated by many different areas of race and ethnicity. So this has some examples of ways that it's very politically relevant, and others where maybe we could think about ways in which the data could be more politically relevant for this setting. So this is a really long list with really small print, so I'm going to zoom in on certain sections. So first, I want to point out ways that they integrate political relevance really very well within this data system. So they have very specific measures for country of origin or your ethnic identity for those Asian and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders. So you see they have pretty sizable populations of people from Fiji or Samoa or Tonga, even countries they have, Laos, Sri Lanka. So they have in California, we can understand that they have pretty sizable Pacific Islander and Asian American populations where it makes sense to break them out into these categories. At the same time, they also do the same thing with this Southwest Asian North African, and we get really small numbers. So like we have 2 Djiboutian students, 4 Mauritian students. So we get into privacy concerns at this point. Someone could look around and say, oh, I know exactly who you're talking about because there's only 2 and you have them just listed there. So we get into some privacy concerns, and we also think, are these really politically relevant categorizations in this context? So I live in Washington, D.C., where we have very large, refugee populations and immigrant populations, where some of these would be much more politically relevant here in DC or in New York than they would be in California. And California understands this idea of political relevance. We can see when they looked at the white category, then they have 2 options, white or other white. We can see for American Indian, they did not break it out by tribal identity. It's just American Indian, Alaskan Native. They don't have any Central American or South American countries. So they are breaking it out by country of origin sometimes and not other times. So we can see this idea of political relevance play out. So this is just encouraging individual administrative data systems to think, what is politically relevant within my context that I need to be paying attention to, and making those purposeful decisions instead of kind of accidentally making our way there. The next one is to collect data over time. So the census estimates point to at least 3% of adults changing their self-reported race ethnicity over time, but surveys of adolescents have found that these rates are higher among that age group. Even surveys that were done at home versus at school, adolescents are prone to give different answers if you ask them in different spaces, as well as across time. So that's what makes it important to make sure you're continuing to update that that measure as often as you can. This is becoming even more tricky with DNA testing. So let's say that you've always identified as white, but then you do a 23andMe DNA test and you get the results shown on the screen. Some people would start checking African American, and there's evidence that this is happening more and more. So collecting that information over time at least gives us a window into how people are changing their self-reported race ethnicity in ways that we've missed out on if we just ask once upon intake and then never again. Similarly, this can be helped by linking to other data sources. So often what we saw in the literature was suggestions to link to birth certificates if possible. This can help create encourage validity and reliability in some cases. This could also be done by eased through creating standardized measurement systems. We saw this in the medical fields, that they would suggest that the American Medical Association should create a measurement system for race and ethnicity to reinforce linkages across systems. So we could always do something like that as well. AARA or SREE could have some sort of measurement system they suggest, and that would help create these linkages across data systems if we're measuring things using a similar format. And the last one is helping, has to do with this idea of bridging. So when often this issue comes up when we're trying to aggregate these measures of inequality to understand broader trends in inequality. And like Dominique was mentioning, what a lot of administrative data analysts do is they create ranking systems, like which racial identity trumps the other, like Dominique's example was Black was trumping all. I've seen Hispanic trump or American Indian. People will pick different ones, or sometimes they just throw out the data. If someone identifies multiracial, they just won't include them at all. So one solution to this issue is to have another item separate from the racial and ethnicity item, that if someone does select multiple categories, they can then be asked if there is one they most identify with or that best represents their identity. This can help to bridge between data systems and resolve this issue where people sometimes are throwing out data or ranking people's identities for them. It gives them an option to rank, making sure in this list to include multiracial as one of the options, and always keeping this as a separate item, still allowing people to select multiple racial or ethnic identities before this measure. So just to summarize, we have these 6 suggestions of incorporating country of origin and language, considering ways we can understand and measure color in more authentic ways than we do at the moment, keeping in mind political relevance in our measures, collecting measures over time, linking to other sources, and incorporating a most identifier best represents item in our system. So we will pause here for Q&A just on measurement. Like Dominique said, we're going to do a separate pause for analysis, and then at the end, we'll take broader questions as well.
Thank you. So there are a couple of questions. One is about missing data. And so someone asked, administrative data may suffer from non-random missingness on race and ethnicity variable. For example, you're more likely to report your racial identity when you have interactions with government staff. For example, if you fail to pay child support. So the missingness comes from the systemic issue. How would you deal with this non-random missingness when working with administrative data?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll say, and please definitely Sam, correct me if I'm wrong. I think from our survey of the literature, and then just a lot of our thinking around this, to me, I am more inclined to actually create a category that's literally called race missing, and to actually use that information because it's a choice that was made frequently, and I'm much less willing to entertain sort of multiple imputation of race when it's missing for those reasons. But Sam, I'm interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, if you take a look at the paper, what we have information on at the end, we get into some ways people have thought about missingness. So there are very specific methods that are similar to multiple imputation, but specifically designed for race and ethnicity that we talk about in there. I personally haven't used any of those. I found using K-12 data that this is less of an issue. I find racial identity is rarely, it's missing as much as anything else in K-12 data. I found, 2-3%, just like every other measure. So I haven't had personally to encounter that as much. The bigger issue in K-12 data is more when we see contradictory information or maybe just changing information, and that's a different question than missingness. There's this idea of that you could also get into on like fractional methods for trying to figure this out, but not for like individual regressions, but if you're just trying to aggregate, understand inequality at a system level, that people have also discussed. But personally, it's been less of an issue that I've encountered, but certainly in the paper, we have several solutions that others have used.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things that I'll go off that as well. So like in higher ed, we can get a lot of race, ethnicity missingness, and it's been trending and shifting over time. There's a lot of great work from Carly Sarita Ford, who I strongly recommend you check out, that thinks about when is race not reported? When is race missing? What does that look like? What does that mean? And I think that's part of what has guided for me, that I'm less willing to treat missingness as if it's at random when it comes to race data, because exactly what the question asker is saying, I don't think it's at random. You're welcome for the shout out, girl.
I know there's another, there's more to come, but there was another quick question that referred to something that Sam had mentioned about someone is confused about the contradiction between the previous comment around using self-reported data, but then also a later comment about linking that to standardized data, such as like the birth certificate example that you use. So if you could just expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, I think, and Dominique, I remember you really like this paper. Do you remember this one about the birth certificates? But I think the idea is just having more information, probably to address missing data, right. Or if you have some sort of contradiction, maybe mischievous responders could be an issue, because I deal with data from teenagers. But yeah, do you have any other comments on that as well?
No, I think what you're saying exactly, that typically we're thinking about triangulating when we have concerns about that missingness, that we're concerned that there's non-random missingness in race ethnicity, and you're trying to build out the data set as much as possible, and you are going to use case-wise deletion. So you are going to delete people who have missing information on some of your variables, that can be a helpful piece. It can also be helpful potentially. So part of the thing that can get challenging, I know I'm currently doing a research project using Texas state administrative data. And I have race information as self-reported from students every term that they're enrolled. And so I have students whose self-report changes over time depending on the term. And so in those instances, you might think self-report is still the sort of gold standard, the way Sam was saying, but you have multiple pieces of self-report there. So how do you try to think about what variable you're going to make that be?
I think we're good for now, because I know we want to make sure we have time for to move on to the next section, and then we'll circle back on some questions toward the end.
Awesome. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the analysis side. And so there are these two things that sound very innocuous. One is know your measures, right? Understand how the race ethnicity measures are created in the data that you're using, and be purposeful about incorporating the measures into models. This is just one of those things you all know, right? Where you write in a paper and you write this one sentence, it's I cleaned the data or something. And that encompasses 5 months worth of work. But it's just that one sentence. That is what I view that top line note to be, because it's really about the fact, one of my dear friends, Ben Skinner at the University of Florida, always says to me that clean data is just data that somebody else cleaned for you. And so when you get state administrative data, or you get some other type of administrative data, somebody has cleaned that data up. Somebody took it from that example that we showed you and put it into whatever you're receiving. And the reason that matters is because all those decisions I was asking you all to make administrators do that all the time without any clue about your research questions or what you're interested in doing. And so that means that you really want to, as deeply as you can, understand how your race ethnicity measures were created. What this means is when I get a new data set that I'm doing analysis on, I probably spend, give or take, a month to maybe 2 months making sure I deeply understand that data. I will do things like I'll get a report that has been like publicly released by whoever put the data together, and I'll make sure that I can replicate that report. So I make sure that I'm understanding what variables they used and in what ways they use them, right? So like I do a lot of research looking at race and student loans and borrowing. And so I will frequently, the first thing I'll do when I get a data set is I try to replicate some sort of report that's like a crosstab of racial ethnic groups and the amount that they've borrowed, and make sure that those numbers match up with what I can actually run. If they don't, then I don't fully understand their data and I need to spend more time exploring. I will sometimes reach out to people who put together the reports to try to make sure that I'm understanding how things got put together. But it's just really important. You cannot believe that you automatically know how other people put together race ethnicity data, because there's just too many, if you look at the chat and all the different questions and concerns that people are bringing up that are completely correct and really thoughtful, like all of those things went into the data that you were just sort of receiving on a file or that you're VPNing to in some sort of restricted environment. And so it matters a lot how they made that data when you think about A, how you're going to use that data in your own work, but then B, what the implications of your findings are. And so it's really important to sort of deeply understand how that data was put together. And I'll say for the second point, right, that encouraging field-wide best practices, right, that standards for measurement and reporting can really help to clarify how data are supposed to be analyzed. Part of the joy of the wild, wild west of education policy research is that education is not a discipline, right? Education is an interdisciplinary field. And so that means that there are folks in the disciplines, sociology, anthropology, economics, history. There are also people who purely have studied education, who are all interested in thinking about education policy research in unique and exciting ways. But what that means is we rarely have field-wide, education-wide recommendations or sort of like best practices for how you want to think about your data before you get prepared to analyze it. Because a lot of us come from different disciplinary backgrounds. And so we think that it would be helpful for these types of things to at least be talked about, thought about. And that's a lot of the motivation behind why Sam and I wanted to do our survey of just what do people do? What are people doing now with race ethnicity data? Because we honestly didn't know. Next slide, please. So the analysis of these sort of complex racial ethnic identities, we try to think about, number one, focusing on the most politically relevant complex identities for each context. And that Sam did a really great job like showing examples of that. But the main thing that's sort of a takeaway from number one is to not assume that like the 5 categories that the census provides is exactly what you need for your study. There may be very good reasons that you need to go much deeper than those 5 or all sorts of things. So just not assuming that the way that you receive the racial ethnic data is the way that you have to use it. Number 2, be aware of multicollinearity and privacy concerns. So this gets really tricky, and we have some suggestions that we got from the literature, but I will also say, right, that depending on whose data you're using, they will have rules themselves about when you have to mask because cell sizes have become too small. And it's an important piece that you want to be thinking about really carefully when it comes to privacy concerns. Now, because of that, that doesn't mean that you have to pretend that like race ethnicity isn't there, it doesn't matter. And this also can go in particular for thinking about something that Sam was mentioning earlier, that's sort of, we know that we need a certain sample size when we're trying to think about statistical significance as an example. And so we can sometimes say, I'm not going to study Indigenous students, American Indian, Native American, Alaska Native students, because they're just such a small sample that there's no way that they're going to be statistically significant. We could have an equally long session about what statistical significance means and what a p.05 means and all those sorts of things. We don't have the time for that. So what I will just emphasize is that statistical significance is not the end all be all of quantitative research. There are ways that we can think about doing estimates with subpopulation groups, looking at descriptives and thinking about what they look like, that do not always have to involve thinking about whether or not you have reached a P of 0.49. And so because of that, something is statistically significant. There are a lot of really important and powerful things that quantitative analysis can do, even when we're not talking about whether or not something is statistically significant. And that doesn't mean that that work is not rigorous. What it means is you need to be really clear and upfront in your work about what it can and it cannot say. This is like, I am sort of infamous as a reviewer, apologies to all the editors that read multiple reviews of mine, that like, I'm completely open to hearing about causal quantitative research and descriptive quantitative research. What I want to hear about is what the work can and cannot say, and what is the strength of the evidence that we have in front of us. Because exactly what Derek just said in the chat, statistical significance and practical significance are not the same thing. And sometimes they could be at cross sections, right? So it's really important that we don't just allow ourselves to think, well, I need to have groups that are of a certain sample size in order to make sure I can do statistical significance. Because I'll also throw out there that most of the time when people are doing causal work that's not an RCT or an experiment, I frequently don't see a power analysis. So more often than not, when we're doing things, you know, with econometrics, like a difference in difference, it's frequent when I even see it with regression discontinuity designs. I don't see power analysis done. And so I think that sometimes people are sort of giving themselves a little bit of a sort of instinctual response to say, oh, well, if the group is getting on the smaller side, I can't do that because there's no way I can get statistical significance. And I would ask us to think a little bit more deeply about what the purpose of our analysis is, and whether or not that's solely focusing on what a p-value is. And then the third piece, so using fractional methods for aggregating data to incorporate information from individuals. So there's a lot in the literature that other folks have done to think about whether or not you can have fractional methods like of individuals, like of individual students, in order to then think at the institution or the state level in a way that could potentially fill in missing data. What I will say to that is, I think that is an incredibly fraught method. That there are a lot of ways that by using fractional methods, you can get right back to that sort of biological essentialism and a eugenics approach to statistics. And so you want to be really careful that this was enough in the literature that we wanted to make sure we talk about it. But you need to be incredibly careful and thoughtful about why you would be using these methods, because if what you're using it is, for those of you who don't know, I am Black, my partner and husband is white. And so if we had a child at some point by fractional methods, right, they would be 50% white and 50% Black. But it's really important to think about, well, why would you think that a fraction is meaningful in that way? If the child presents like I do, then when they're engaging with people, I don't know that the fractional method will sort of subsume all of their experiences. Because the important thing to keep in mind, I think, is we've been talking a lot about this in a way because Sam and I know each other very well and our intentions and motivations, but I want to make it explicit something here. When we have measures that are in models, we frequently say that we're looking at like a measure of race. And that's not really what you're looking at when you think about like the beta coefficient in a regression. What you're looking at is like the compounded experiences of that person's sort of lived experiences. So what we can think about is, in some ways, these are more measures of things like racism than they are measures of race. That's what we're sort of interested in exploring and unpacking further. And so when you think that putting a variable called race on the right-hand side of a regression model, we're actually exploring and thinking about more often than not, when you are putting that in, you're trying to think about like, what is that person's lived experience like? And one of the sort of pieces of the lived experience that you're interested in is how the world engages with them and they move through the world based on their race, ethnicity. So I think just you want to be really careful when you're thinking about these sort of fractional methods. Boom. So we'll pause there. And I saw that there were like some questions coming in. So thinking about more of these analysis-based questions.
Yeah, so first, one question is if you have any articles that, folks should read or, would think, or I mean, knowing you two, obviously there is an extensive list to be clear, but if there are some, just really ones that sort of challenge you or, helped you think about some of these questions, either drop them in the chat or send them to me and I'll put them in the chat. But I know that that was a question that's just sort of broad. Or more of a comment in the famous AER way. AERA way. I have more of a comment than a question. But so to the point of analysis.
Oh, wait, do you want us to answer that a little bit?
Sure, if you'd like to. I was just, again, trying to make sure we cover a lot of things. But if you can think of a few right now that just stand out to you, I can also try and type those names in the chat while you're talking.
Sure. Did you want to start, Sam, or did you want me
Sure,
to?
I just had one that I was going to bring up because there was a few questions in the chat about the idea of like the phenotype measure. So I have one article that I love that was an educational researcher by Carla Monroe. I just put it in the chat, called Colorizing Educational Research, African American Life and Schooling as an Exemplar. I find that, I found this article to be a really great summary of why we don't think about colorism enough in educational research. And we really haven't made any progress since that 2013 article. But that gives some of how my thinking has been shaped about how we could do better, because colorism is a really important aspect of inequality that if you talk to people, people talk about it all the time, but it's not in any quantitative models. I mean, we don't really investigate it at all. So I really highly recommend that piece.
All right, so I've gone to my library. I don't agree with every point in these, and in fact, am famous for texting screenshots of some of my thoughts. But so I will say that White Logic, White Methods is a great book if you want to get a bit of a primer. You are like, you want to dabble this a little bit more, you want to better understand. I think that's great. I will also say I really appreciate the Possessive Investment in Whiteness, which talks a lot about, I think, our country and culture, and that ties directly into all of the ways we think about our methods and how we sort of set up and design our data sets. And I think it can be very illuminating in a lot of ways. But also I'll throw out that, like, if you check out some of my paper in RER, which we got well, we have the citation that's up later, but we also point to some other pieces that can be read. And if I find some time, I'll try to put together a list of some things and like do a Twitter thread of it at some point.
Oh, that would be wonderful.
Yeah,
and that's purely selfish because I also want to know too. So thank you. But yeah, so a question about analysis, right? So you were mentioning about when a group is too small, perhaps like not enough and less than 20. Is it best to aggregate that group with quote unquote the other variable, or is there another way that you recommend?
So I'll throw out there, so now I love it. Everybody was asking like, well, but what's my research question and stuff like that when we were doing the activity. And I was like, no, it doesn't matter what your research question is. But on the analysis side, it incredibly matters what your research question is. Like that is just an incredibly important part of this. And so I will say that what your research question is, what your theory or conceptual framework are, really should be what dictate your models. I know that sometimes people just sort of throw things in models to see what's happening. And I would encourage people to think a lot more about what their theory and conceptual frameworks are and allow them to guide their modeling strategy, because that should hopefully give them a clearer piece. And I'll even say, and then I'm going to shut up and throw it over to Sam, but like I'm currently doing this project and I am looking at the most racial categories I can because I have to rely on the census, which is very frustrating. But you could make an argument, right, that like what I should do is, the indigenous population should just sort of be subsumed in a different group. And what I say is these ends are going to be too small to look at statistical significance. And then I leave them as separate groups so that you can at least see what trends look like over time, et cetera, because with the census, like it's a census. So we can actually have different arguments about what standard errors are used for when you have a full population of people. And so because of that, I just left them separate. So I think it really depends on your research questions, your theory, and your conceptual framework.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I've tended over time to include more nuance in the measures as much as possible, given the data, which is usually the data's, really that 5 category restriction, that 5 to 7 probably. But like I have an intersectionality paper looking at racial identity and gender identity intersectionality, and some of the end sizes get pretty small, but as long as it's over 20, I include it. Under 20, we get into weird statistical territory, but technically you can analyze it, and you just always have that caveat in all of the estimates, because this isn't census data like Dominique's talking about. These are usually surveys, probability surveys. But you can say, this is what the coefficient looks like. It's not going to be statistically significant because of power issues, but it's estimated in a way that's statistically it's not incorrect like it would be if it was too small. So that's kind of the territory I feel my work is getting into.
Thank you. So I am watching time, and I know there's a little bit more I think that you have in the presentation, but I do want to just, since we're on the topic of analysis and encouraging people to think through, like you were saying about like how you're creating your models and what you want to do with this research, right? And so there have actually been a couple of questions about controlling for race and, whether that's you're being accused of being racist if you control for race, or what does that even mean, and how people think about it, and how common it is that we just do it. We say that I've controlled for race. Like, how do you have any recommendations or any thoughts about how we might work through that for ourselves, or how we might describe it in the writing, or whether that's even sort of the right avenue to take?
Dominique?
Oh, thanks. Okay, good. Lord have mercy. Yes. Okay. So I come back to one of the things that I was saying a little bit earlier around the fact that frequently when we say we're controlling for race, we're not actually controlling for race, right? But frequently, when someone is interested in race being a part of the covariates, the control, something on the right-hand side, what they're actually saying is, I want a measure of the compounding systemic discrimination that this person has faced. And the best way that I can get a measure of the compounding systemic discrimination that someone has faced is by checking to see, do they identify as Black? Do they right? Frequently, that's why we put gender on the right-hand side as well, right? Like, we don't say these things, but that's frequently the reason undergirding why that's happening. And so I think a big thing is to just, from the first moment, you should ask yourself why you're including the variables you're including. What is the purpose behind each one of these measures that you're including? And then from there, I think, is the question that you can ask, like, okay, if that's why I'm including it, is that in the paper? And I think that really matters a lot, because we make a lot of decisions. Sam mentioned this at the top. One of my favorite papers that recently came out, like last year, and it won awards correctly, because it was so dope. But basically, they gave like the same data set to different research teams, like gave them, I think, like maybe the same research question, and they all none of them found the same thing. The magnitude of the coefficients were all different. They were in different directions. Statistical significance was different. And this was all based on decisions that they made with the data. Like, they all received the same data set. Decisions that they made with the data in analysis that, like, a number of them wouldn't have even been included in the paper. And so for me, I'm a big believer in trying to over communicate what you've done with the data. It's why at this point, I don't know if I can write a paper that doesn't have an appendix section talking more about the decisions I made about my data, because it just feels like I gotta say more about this. And so part of the big issue with that is that so Sam and I are working with some excellent colleagues, Carly Ford and Mark Guerrero, but I also know that a colleague of ours, Richard Blissett, is working on a separate paper where we're sort of looking at work that's been published previously and how they use race ethnicity. So, like, our team is looking just period, how are you categorizing and thinking about race ethnicity in your work? Richard's team is actually looking at, like, quant studies and looking to see sort of what's going on, how are you measuring, stuff like that. And what we typically seem to find is that nobody's justifying most of their stuff. They're just like, we threw race in there. And it's like, well, but why, homie? What's happening here? I'm sure there's a reason, right? Like, I am sure there's a very good reason that you did this, but you never told me what that reason was. And so I think, to me, a lot of this would be helped if we were really upfront with ourselves and then with readers about why we made the decisions that we made. The same way that, right, like, you can give me all the reasons under the sun why this difference in difference upholds the assumptions for parallel trends. You could give me reasons why race is included and why it's included in the way it is. Oh, and sorry, I couldn't tell if the link is correct in the chat, but it's from Nicholas Huntington Klein, the article, and I'll try to look it up as Sam goes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a challenge. I mean, what I've found is, Dominique and I are both tenure track assistant professors, and we are bound by the constrictures of editors and reviewers and what others expect of us. So it's been difficult because it is just an expectation to just control for it and not explain it. And when you try to do something different, I've often found there's pushback. And I think this is definitely an area where we are both thinking very intentionally. And that's part of why we wrote this paper and why we're working on this next study about how we can encourage the field to be more intentional and to have a better idea of how we handle this in educational research broadly, instead of each of us individually just trying to write a paper and hoping it gets through the peer review process. I know a lot of people here are not in those kind of positions, but that's certainly our positionality I think we're bringing to it in answering the question.
Right, and there could be a whole other conversation about the peer review publication process and how welcoming maybe the word is around issues of, obviously like critical methods, critical theories, and all of that, but we don't have time for that today. So I know we have about 10-ish more minutes, 10 to 13 more minutes. So any final thoughts? I know you might have a few more slides, and then maybe one or two sort of last questions.
Yeah. Is this me or you?
Do you want to?
Sure, let's do it.
Okay.
So the main thing we just want to have people take away from this is to always try to think about the fact that there are people behind the data. There is no data point that we as education policy researchers are studying that ultimately doesn't come back to people. Even if you're studying institutions or schools, right? Like the reason we care about them is because of the people that are inside them. And so we want to do what we can. Sam and I are unapologetic that we are interested in increasing racial equity and justice. And so because of that, we are focused on finding ways to do that, even in papers that are not necessarily nominally about racial equity and justice. That's still a thing that matters to us. And so we want to take it really seriously. And I think that's the last, except for, so in the top left is the citation for Sam and my overview of administrative data collection, contact information and other stuff like that from us. I'm gonna throw it back over if we have any like last minute questions, but I will do my best to maybe sometime later today or next week, try to think of some nice readings that have been helpful for Sam and I and our colleagues as we try to think through some of these pieces to throw some sort of thread out there.
Yeah, and certainly most, if not all of the ones we talked about are in the article as well. Yeah, so we have another, 10 minutes for more questions. I'm excited to answer more.
Yeah, thank you. And I know a few people had asked about obviously your citation and then your contact information. So
dope.
Please feel free for those in the audience to reach out on Twitter to our wonderful speakers. And so, and also thank you for everyone who has posted questions. I apologize, we're not going to be able to get through all of them, but I think, as you can see in the comments in the chat, this has been really, really helpful. There was a question though about international research, and I think we can hopefully get a little bit of attention to that. So someone mentioned that they are conducting international research and have, there are some challenges to this very sort of American dominant perspective in the way that we essentially approach most things that we do as a country, right? And so there's a point this person made that even creating a survey question about minority status is inappropriate in particular cultural contexts. Mm-hmm. So do you have any suggestion on other ways to quantitatively analyze equity besides disaggregating by demographics?
Yeah, like I briefly mentioned, this looks very different in different countries. There's a lot of literature about like the UK and their system, and the way they think about race and ethnicity is so different. I mean, if you put one of their items on one of our surveys, people would think you're crazy. I mean, the cultural differences are so huge. I would say in general, I'm a firm believer that if you don't have a measure for it, it won't get attended to. So if you don't have a sense of where people are coming from, I think that part of the reason that we were supposed to have, a Middle Eastern, Northern African item on the census, and it was taken off as a recognition that if we had better measures of that population, we might actually have to attend to inequality of people who identify of that ancestry. As long as it's hidden, we don't have to deal with it. So I would just push back on this idea that we could avoid knowing. I mean, obviously different cultural contexts, I said deal with this differently, but within like a system where there is racial ethnic inequality, avoiding it is only going to let it continue, would be my concern.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree. I'll just say that I think it's really system specific. So if you're in South Africa, what do typical surveys ask when they're trying to get at this question, if it's particularly fraught or politically sensitive? And then doing the best that I can to align with that. But that is going to be incredibly dependent on the country and the cultural environment.
No, that makes sense. Thank you. And so I think our last question sort of takes a little bit of a different spin. And just thinking about if you could talk through maybe or give some ideas about how you would take a strengths-based perspective in these analyses, given that, when we think about, I do K-12 work, and when we're talking about like students of color, Black children, it's always this deficit. Well, of course, this is the results. Well, of course, like, see, why wouldn't it work out this way, right? Talking about findings and things like that. So what could a more strengths-based, asset-based spin or perspective, how could you place that on this sort of quantitative research, and sort of continuing in what you've been talking about so far, but really honing in on a strengths-based view?
I'm happy to start. So I've reflected a lot on this, before, during, and after we were writing this. And so what I've been thinking about in my work is, if I want to write about racial inequality, I need to find another element to my analysis that is not just focused on measuring and understanding inequality. It has to push. So like I have a manuscript about how racially minoritized students in high schools historically feel less safe at school than white students. And so I was like, well, I could write a paper just about that, or I could think about the next step. What happens after this when students feel less safe at school? And so I integrated ecological assets framework using nationally representative survey data that asked items having to do with student assets to understand how racially minoritized students can mobilize assets to past high school to help them to navigate challenges that they might have encountered in secondary education. So I think that's just an example of how I'm trying to push myself, but this is something I'm always asking. I think the big thing in this framework is living in these questions and thinking about these questions.
Yeah, I will say I love that. I think, as we're wrapping up, like, a big thing to me is that this type of webinar should be seen as like a nice area to push yourself, but like, it's not the end. Because like, this is not the end for me and Sam. Like, we will continue to think about these things. We will continue to like push ourselves, challenge ourselves, maybe think like, I said this a year ago, but now I'm thinking more like this. This is a fluid process of always trying to make ourselves better. It's the same way, right? That like, I didn't know, right. We could tell ourselves that, like 7 years ago, we didn't know that if you have different timing of treatment for a difference in difference, that there was all sorts of things that needed to get changed in how you estimate it in a way that we do now, right? We try to keep up to date with methods. We try to make sure that we're learning the new thing and that we're checking it out, and we want to be as careful and thoughtful and rigorous as possible. We should apply that exact same type of careful long-term PD, if you will, and thinking about rigor to race and ethnicity the same way we do to our methods.
Yeah, no, I like that idea of like pushing ourselves and thinking about what's next, and really thinking about like the story we're trying to tell, right? Mm-hmm. Is it that something is happening with students, or is that the institution has been broken for so long and we need to really bring attention to that, right? And so I just want to thank everyone. Thank obviously our panelists and our speakers, Dr. Baker, Dr. Viano, for your wonderful presentation today. Just again, in the comments, you can see everyone thought that this was wonderful and enlightening and engaging. And so again, thinking to our audience, asking them to think about what's next, right? Like, how will you continue to do this work? So thank you all for joining us today. Just a few reminders that abstracts for the SREE conference are due on Monday, and that the next webinar in this series will be on Friday, May 20th at 2 p.m. Eastern time. Hope
And I'm
that
just,
everyone, oh yeah.
Nicole, I just also want to throw out a special shout out to my favorite Dr. Baker, who is currently watching this. So thanks, Dad, for always finding time to watch my sessions. We're good.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Baker, in the audience too.
You know, yeah.
No, hey, you gotta, I hear you, right?
It's part of the fun.
So thank you everyone for attending, and hopefully we'll see you all. You'll be able to join us next time on May 20th.